The spaceport bar on the neutral planet of Zorath was as chaotic as always. It was a popular spot for travelers from all over the galaxy, where aliens of all shapes and sizes gathered to relax, share stories, and drink strange, colorful concoctions that humans could only dream of understanding. The air was thick with laughter, chatter, and the hum of intergalactic languages mixing together. At one of the farthest tables, near a corner that seemed to avoid all the madness, sat Eli Porter, a human. He had just arrived on his first trip to Zorath, and despite the strange environment, he remained calm. The alien races around him were unfamiliar, but Eli didn't mind. He'd been to worse places before. His mission was simple: relax, have a drink, and keep his eyes on the door. The bar was full of rowdy aliens and an assortment of species Eli couldn't even begin to identify. However, a sudden argument between three very distinct-looking aliens caught his attention. These weren't just any bar brawlers, these were serious fighters. Their presence alone made the air tense with anticipation. At the center of this heated discussion stood Zokar, a towering reptilian with thick green scales and sharp teeth that were visible even when his mouth was closed. His eyes, cold and unfeeling, scanned the crowd, daring anyone to challenge his opinion. Standing opposite him was Kelix, a pale insectoid alien with 6 legs and large compound eyes that never seemed to blink. Finally, there was Vara, a well-dressed humanoid diplomat from the Zarin Empire. She was a smooth talker, often navigating delicate political situations, but even she looked a little out of her depth now. The subject of their debate was ridiculous, at least to anyone who didn't understand the gravity of the conversation. "Water is not wet," Zokar growled, his deep voice shaking the table. "Water can't be wet. It's a liquid. You can't describe it as wet. Wetness is the result of being covered by liquid, but liquid is not wet by itself." Kelix clicked his mandibles in irritation. His voice was high-pitched and whirring. "You're wrong, Zokar. Water is, by its very nature, wet. Anything water touches becomes wet. It is the essence of wetness. You're just too primitive to understand the concept." Vara raised a hand, attempting to intervene. "Please, gentlemen, let's not turn this into a—" But before she could finish, Zokar snapped back, his temper flaring. "Primitive? You've got to be kidding me. The concept of wetness has nothing to do with liquid. It's all about perception." His tail thrashed across the floor, sending a nearby chair crashing to the side. The entire bar fell silent, and the conversation quickly gained the attention of the other patrons. Eli glanced up from his drink, noticing the tension in the air. It wasn't just a debate anymore. The entire bar seemed to be drawn into the argument. From all corners of the room, a variety of voices began shouting their opinions. Some agreed with Zokar, insisting that water couldn't be wet. Others sided with Kelix, arguing that water was indeed the embodiment of wetness. The debate grew louder, and suddenly everyone seemed to be shouting. Eli leaned back in his seat and took another sip of his drink. He wasn't sure what had prompted him to come to Zorath, but he knew that this was certainly more entertaining than most of his missions. "Water isn't wet," Zokar roared again, his voice reverberating off the walls. "It's just a liquid. That's all." "No, no, no," Kelix retorted, his sharp antennae trembling with the force of his words. "Water is the source of wetness. It can't exist without making things wet. It's basic science." The shouting grew louder as the aliens began to circle around each other, posturing, pointing, and waving their arms. At first it looked like a normal debate, but then a chair was thrown and someone slammed a mug of glowing liquid onto the floor. The brawl had officially started. Eli didn't flinch. He wasn't even worried. As the room erupted into chaos with tables flying and chairs toppling, Eli remained the calm center in the storm. He'd seen plenty of bar fights before, some even involving humans, but this one was on a different scale. Aliens were everywhere, throwing punches, blasting energy weapons, and shouting nonsensical insults. It was a true intergalactic spectacle. Zokar and Kelix continued to argue in the middle of the bar, oblivious to the chaos around them. Vara, trying to regain control, was caught in the middle of a group of drunk alien patrons who were cheering them on like they were watching a gladiator fight. "I thought we were supposed to be civilized," Vara muttered under her breath, but no one heard her over the noise. She quickly ducked as a bar stool flew by her head, narrowly missing her. As the fight raged on, Eli watched the absurdity unfold. A particularly large alien covered in purple scales picked up a table and hurled it across the room, hitting someone who had been quietly sipping their drink. The individual, a short but fierce-looking woman, stood up, wiped the drink off her face, and punched the purple-scaled alien square in the jaw. Eli couldn't help but smile. It was like a symphony of chaos, and it was oddly mesmerizing. The entire bar was a mess, but everyone was so caught up in their own little world that they seemed to forget the real purpose of the gathering: relaxation. Here, in this chaotic spaceport bar, the only thing that mattered was who could shout the loudest and throw the best punch. For Eli, this was nothing new. He'd been to enough strange places in the universe to know that this kind of thing was just part of the intergalactic experience. Still, he couldn't help but wonder if there was a deeper lesson to be learned from all of this. Maybe the aliens needed to understand that sometimes it wasn't worth fighting over something as ridiculous as water being wet. But then again, maybe the universe wasn't ready for that kind of philosophy. Eli finished his drink and stood up, still unbothered by the mayhem around him. He walked casually past the fighting aliens, avoiding the occasional blast of energy from a nearby table, and made his way to the door. As he stepped outside, he couldn't help but let out a small laugh. This was one of the most absurd things he had ever witnessed, and he had a feeling the story would be a good one to tell when he returned home. The chaos continued behind him, but Eli walked on, calm as ever. He had learned something today, but it wasn't about the debate over water. It was about how easily a small thing could turn into something much larger, and how, in the end, it was the quietest ones who could walk away unaffected. The noise inside the bar continued, as if the galaxy itself had come to watch the spectacle. Aliens of all shapes and sizes were still yelling at each other, throwing objects and bumping into tables. A chaotic mess of sound and light filled the air, but Eli Porter was nowhere near affected. He'd been in worse places before, and this was just another strange experience in the vast universe. However, as he stepped outside for a brief moment of fresh air, he couldn't help but think about how absurd it all was. Water is wet? The question itself seemed ridiculous now, but for these aliens it had become something worth fighting over. As Eli stood under the dim light of the spaceport's docking bay, he found himself lost in thought. The peaceful quiet of the night sky seemed to mock the chaos within the bar. He had a strange feeling that what he was seeing wasn't just about the debate. There was something deeper, something about the pride and egos of the species around him. This wasn't just a bar brawl. It was a battle of identities, a clash of cultures. Suddenly, a voice interrupted his thoughts. "Hey you, the human." The voice was loud, almost as if it had been intentionally raised to get his attention. Eli turned to see Vara, the Zarin diplomat, standing at the entrance of the bar, looking disheveled. Her usual calm and collected demeanor had been replaced by one of annoyance and frustration. Her clothes were torn in places, and she had a look of disbelief on her face. Eli raised an eyebrow but didn't speak. Instead, he waited for her to approach, knowing she wasn't done. Vara shook her head as she walked up to him. "You saw all of that, didn't you? The debate, the fight. They were all arguing over something so foolish, and you just stood there doing nothing." She paused, trying to make sense of the situation. "Why didn't you do something?" Eli took a deep breath, taking in the cool air. "What was there to do?" Vara blinked. "You could have stopped it." "You're a human!" "You could have stopped it?" Eli asked, cutting her off with a raised hand. "You think stopping a fight like that is what it needed?" He chuckled. "You saw it, didn't you? It wasn't about the debate. It was about their egos, their pride. If I stepped in, they would have fought even more. Oh, they needed to realize it themselves." Vara frowned, but she didn't argue. She didn't understand why the human was so calm in the face of such chaos, but something about his words made sense. "You let them fight," she muttered, crossing her arms. "But they'll never learn if they keep going on like this." "They'll learn," Eli said quietly. "Maybe not today, but eventually." He took another deep breath, watching the stars above. "The real question is, why do they fight over something so simple?" Vara stared at him, almost as if waiting for more, but Eli didn't give her anything else. He just stood there, quiet and composed. She sighed. "I guess that's what humans are good at, isn't it? Watching, waiting, learning. I can't say I understand it, but I suppose you're right." After a pause, she looked at him with a slightly different expression. "Do you always stay calm like this?" Eli shrugged. "Most of the time. People get caught up in their emotions. I've learned not to. It's usually better to step back and let things settle. Vara nodded slowly. There was something about Eli's simplicity that made her rethink her usual approach to everything. I guess that's why humans are so different from the rest of us, she said almost to herself. Before Eli could reply, a loud crash came from inside the bar. The sound of clashing furniture and shouted insults could be heard even from the open doorway. Eli sighed but didn't move. Looks like they're still at it, Vara said with a shake of her head. This is ridiculous. Eli smiled lightly. They'll figure it out eventually. At that moment, a familiar voice yelled out from the bar. It was Zokar, the giant reptilian still roaring over the noise. Water isn't wet, he shouted at the top of his lungs. The voice was muffled but could still be heard clearly outside. Eli couldn't help but laugh softly. He turned to Vara, who was still staring at him in disbelief. And that, he said, is why I didn't interfere. Vara shook her head, still unable to comprehend it all. You think they'll just stop fighting because they're exhausted or because you're right? Not because I'm right, Eli said, but because eventually they'll realize it's not worth fighting over. Or they'll find something more important to fight about. Vara raised an eyebrow. What do you mean? I mean that when they've spent all their energy on this, they'll either move on or collapse from exhaustion, Eli explained. The universe has a way of making people realize what's truly worth their time. A long silence followed. Vara looked back at the bar. She could still hear the brawl continuing inside. It seemed that nothing would stop the madness. But somehow she began to understand Eli's perspective. Maybe he was right. Sometimes stepping back and letting things run their course was the best approach. It was something her people had always tried to avoid, but perhaps it was time for a change. She turned to Eli, a small smile playing on her lips. You know, you've got a strange way of looking at things. Eli grinned. I like to think it's the human way. Vara nodded slowly as if pondering his words. Maybe I need to see the universe through your eyes more often. Eli took another deep breath, staring up at the sky. The stars glimmered peacefully above and the sounds of chaos continued behind him, but he felt no rush. It was as if in this one moment he was exactly where he needed to be. It's not about seeing the universe differently, Eli said, his voice quiet. It's about understanding that sometimes the quietest voice can be the most powerful one. Just then, there was a sudden silence that spread through the air like a wave. The brawl inside had stopped. Vara turned quickly. What happened? Eli just smiled. Like I said, they'll figure it out. Inside the bar, the argument had come to an abrupt halt. Aliens were standing in stunned silence, looking around at each other, unsure of what to do. Zokar, Kelix, and Vara's diplomatic friend stood awkwardly, as if realizing that the fight over wetness was entirely pointless. A few exchanged sheepish glances, and then, in an odd, hesitant gesture, they all started to laugh. The tension in the air seemed to lift. The brawl had ended, and the bar was now filled with a strange but peaceful energy. Aliens who had once shouted at each other were now shaking hands, offering apologies, and even smiling. Vara walked back into the bar, still a little stunned. She looked around and saw the awkwardness, but she also saw something else. A realization. Maybe the fight wasn't about the debate after all. Eli stood at the entrance, watching them. His calm demeanor hadn't changed. He had been right all along. Sometimes the best thing to do was step back and let others see the truth for themselves. As he turned to leave the bar, he looked up at the stars one last time. It was in moments like this, in the quiet of the universe, that he felt most at home.